Alright, good evening everyone. In my last video with semicolons I had mentioned that there are these things called conjunctive adverbs, and they are adverbs that function in a conjunctive-like way. They can join things, but they do a little more, and I want to show you some examples of their function and some specific words that can be used in that way. So let's have a look at the general categories that conjunctive adverbs can fall into. Alright, so the first category that you could say they fall into, display a result. Like something happens and then this will happen as a result. And so another one though is this idea of concession. Like you concede that something will occur, you say da 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 da, yet this can also happen. So you're kind of just showing that there is another case. Apposition is a case where you're renaming or giving an example of that thing, and that can be really effective. I'm going to show us some examples of these really quick after I list the last 5 categories, and then we'll see some examples. So the next 5 categories are, we have addition, so that's pretty clear, but if you're just going to add on to what you said. We also have time. For instance, if you were to say something like, the election day ended, meanwhile the poll workers gathered their supplies and went home. I mean, it just basically shows that during that time or after that, you're able to kind of see that relationship. Another one would be contrast, just showing difference or drawing a distinction. Summary, that's very similar to conclusions or concluding your thought. And then lastly, I'm going to just put it here because I'm running out of space, reinforcement. So if you sit here, running out of space, reinforcement. So if you want to like add on to something, it's very similar to addition. However, I think you are just reinforcing the existing idea, not really adding a new one. So let's look at some examples, and these words that I'm about to show you are what you would use after a semicolon. They can be used at the beginning of a sentence as well. So after a semicolon or at the beginning of a sentence. So let's see what these are. Okay, great. So for result, one that may have come to mind, one that you may have used before, could be therefore. Another one could be consequently. And after that, we could have something like this. Of course, you know, we have to consider that there are other factors, you know, something like that. So those ones are just some examples. These are not an exhaustive list by any means, but let's look at some more examples of some others. Great, so here we might see, let me back up, sorry. Alright, back in business. So what we have here for concession would be words like nevertheless, yet, which is also a fanboy, one of the normal coordinating conjunctions, still, after all, and some of these you notice will use multiple words, so we're kind of getting into the phrase realm. And then lastly, of course, and again what you're saying is you're basically saying, I recognize there are other possibilities. Concession is a very effective tool of argument and persuasion. Alright, so here for apposition, again, these are just giving examples of something, granted for example. Next we also have for instance. Okay, the quote just kind of represents that you're repeating the same words. Namely is a good one. And in other words is a really effective one. Sorry, I'm going to have to jump up here, forgive me. In other words is a really effective one because it allows you to clearly establish that you're trying to say the same thing but in another way. Alright, so our addition ones, these are just giving you further examples or more of something. Moreover is a good one. It's a bit, kind of mealy-mouthed. So furthermore is sometimes a fine alternative. You could just use also as well. We also have in addition is a possibility. Likewise is a fun one. And just plain old, another word rather, instead of what I was going to write, could also just be further. Instead of furthermore, you could just say further and add on to it in that way. And again, these follow punctuation, they follow semicolons. So they would go here most often, and they're followed by a comma afterwards. But in the way that we're kind of learning to use semicolons, these words will really help you just kind of get comfortable with using these if you find the opportunity to use them. So let's look at our last four categories rather. So here's some representing time, just kind of saying while this was going on, this was also going on, but it has to do with time and when something occurs. So let's get to our next one. So these ones are perhaps the most common that you'll use. However, instead, on the contrary, very effective. Some people, if you use on the other hand, will want you to use on the one hand prior to it. Otherwise, you're just a one-handed person. And so they're kind of forcing you into a dual-handed binary. But that's also an option for contrast. And then the other choices there. But contrast relationships are probably the most common that you'll use. So really make note of this particular list, and just kind of, these ones are good ones to start with in addition to on the contrary. So let's look at our last ones. So for these ones we have the very artificial thus. In conclusion is also artificial. Sometimes you want to avoid these, but in a last-ditch effort, sometimes you may need to use words like these. Thus, in conclusion, then I think you'd want to be really cautious of, but you can use it in this manner. Just kind of maybe showing like, well, then you got to realize that there are other things and to consider. Obviously, you wouldn't necessarily drop into the first person or the second person, but these are some good possibilities. And our last category is reinforcement. And for reinforcement, you may notice a little bit of overlap, for instance, here with further. But these ones I love in particular. Above all, will almost add an emphasis of your point, like la da 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 da. All these good reasons. Above all, though, you see what I mean? Like you get this other more powerful, really summarizing everything and bringing it all together point. But what I hope we can get from this is that these words, with the use of a semicolon, can make the connection between your two independent clauses or the two halves of your sentences very clear. Okay? Some teachers will encourage you to step away from these, but for now, I want to give you this as a tool, and then later on, you can think of more creative ways, or right now, if you're ready, more creative ways to express the connection between the two halves of your sentence. So I hope this helps you. We'll do some exercises trying to create more dynamic connections, and we'll see you next class.